Before we begin, I acknowledge that the land on which our educational home stands is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I pay my respect to the Kumeyaay Nation and to their relationships to their ancestral lands. Tonight's lecture is brought to you by the Francis G. Harps Center for Catholic Thought and Culture at the University of San Diego. The Switgall Lecture is an annual lecture series that was made possible thanks to a generous donation by our USD friend and benefactor, Amelia Switgall. Amelia was born in Czechoslovakia and educated by the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Jesus at their school in Budapest, Hungary. She was forced to flee communism during World War II. And upon coming to the United States, she became a generous philanthropist for Catholic causes, including this lecture series. The Switgall Lecture features an important contemporary Catholic theologian. Previous lectures have included Brian Massengale, Dan Horan, Timothy Radcliffe, and Ronald Rolheiser. Tonight, we feature Dr. Emily Reimer-Barry on Women Deserve Better. Another pro-life movement is possible. Dr. Reimer-Barry is an associate professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego, where she has served as department chair for the past 5 years. Dr. Reimer-Barry writes from the perspective of a feminist Catholic woman whose faith is deeply shaped by feminist spirituality and reflection on embodiment and discourses of power. Recent publications include a book chapter, quote, An Intersectional View of Love and Marriage for Sex, Love, and Families, Catholic Perspectives. She gave a plenary address at the Catholic Theological Society of America at their 2019 annual convention, and has published a major study called Catholic Theology of Marriage in the Era of HIV and AIDS, Marriage for Life, published by Lexington Books. Dr. Reimer-Barry is a regular contributor to the www.catholicmoraltheology.com blog, as well as the forum blog at Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church. She served on the planning committee of the 2-year grant-funded program, Co-Creating the Future of Faith, Women in the Catholic Church, which is recommending to the Bishop of San Diego a model for decision-making in the Catholic Church where the voices of women are adequately represented in a governance structure that is diverse, transparent, ethical, and accountable. Dr. Reimer-Barry is a very popular professor here at the University of San Diego, and as I often say, one of my favorite people here at the university. And so we turn it over to Dr. Reimer-Barry, but before we do that, she will give her lecture. Following her lecture, we will have questions and answers, which we ask you to submit your questions through the chat function, and then we will relay the questions from there. So without further ado, Dr. Reimer-Barry, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jeff, for that very generous introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my shared slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you for this invitation to speak for the Switgall Lecture. I was first asked to share after I presented at the Catholic Theological Society of America conference in June 2019. And I have updated that presentation and adapted it for this audience. And as you will see, my thinking has evolved on these issues over the last 2 years. I want to start by saying that today is International Women's Day. And on International Women's Day, it's a time for us to remember that 132 million girls are out of school. 1 in 3 women globally have experienced physical or sexual violence. Women work longer hours for less pay all around the world. So this talk is dedicated to the women whose stories have brought me to tears, to the women who keep going, to women who persevere, who teach me to have hope in the struggle. What does it mean to be pro-life? What does it mean to be pro-choice? Are these identifiers meaningful for the work that we need to do to build a more just society? My goal tonight is to invite us to think about words and their meanings, and to be open to revising the language that we use so that we can foster more productive debates and more productive alliances, and ultimately to chart a new way forward that seeks common ground, realistic political strategies, and rethinks our ethical priorities in the public square. I understand that the goal of the pro-life movement is to reduce the number of abortions. I will propose a different set of strategies than those currently emphasized by the pro-life and pro-choice movements. So I'll start tonight by talking about how we use pro-choice and pro-life in everyday speech, and then I'll problematize those categories a bit and invite us to move beyond the pro-choice, pro-life binary. I'll then briefly introduce Catholic teachings on life issues and evaluate how leaders from my faith tradition have been applying those teachings to politics lately. Then I'll review some resources from reproductive justice advocates, feminists whose work are already challenging the binary and inviting us to think about what social justice means for women with unplanned pregnancies. And I'll encourage us to think about some of the major themes of the papacy of Pope Francis in relation to all of these questions, and from there propose a constructive way forward for Christians who seek to build a culture of life. And that's a lot to do in 45 minutes, so let's get started. So section 1, our words are inadequate. When Christians refer to the pro-life movement, they're usually talking about the goal of ending legal abortion through legislative means. This movement gained strength and became more ecumenical after the 1973 landmark Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in the US. Sometimes one also hears language regarding the unborn child's right to life. Pro-lifers often describe revulsion at the killing of innocent unborn life. Pro-life in everyday speech tends to mean a recognition of the inherent value of both the maternal and fetal life, and a goal of not seeing these two lives in conflict. In the media, it's a common practice not to use the term pro-life, but rather to translate this activism into the descriptor anti-abortion. This translation is frustrating for many pro-life activists who see their work as constructive and life-affirming. The pro-life movement is a diverse group of activists, many of whom identify religious motivations for their work. They engage in sidewalk counseling at abortion clinics in order to educate patients and try to turn away women seeking abortions. They run pregnancy crisis centers that offer free and/or sliding scale prenatal services, pregnancy tests, ultrasounds, nutrition assistance, supplies, and other kinds of assistance. They organize protest at clinics and marches to show public support for their work. And one major one is the March for Life in January every year. They engage in voter education and mobilization efforts in order to elect pro-life politicians, as well as political lobbying and lawsuits to further their political agenda of reducing access to legal abortion at the local, state, and federal levels. Those who identify as pro-life think the world would be more just if access to legal abortion were curtailed. When people identify as pro-choice, they usually mean that they are not opposed to the legal right of women to procure medical abortion. They see abortions as a legitimate component of comprehensive reproductive health services for women. One often sees the claim that abortions should be safe, legal, and accessible, meaning not only available to the wealthy or privileged, but also to women who are poor, including those on public aid programs. Pro-choice Christians usually do not identify abortion as a moral good, but they are not comfortable with pro-life goals of reducing or eliminating women's access to abortion. Coerced pregnancy and motherhood do not align with a pro-choice understanding of women's inherent dignity and equality to men. Indeed, many point out that thinking about women only as baby carriers is reductionistic. Pro-choice advocates would say that fetal life is a value, but is not the only value at stake. The pro-choice movement is a grassroots movement in the same way that the pro-life movement is, and is built from a broad coalition. The heart of the pro-choice movement is maintaining women's access to abortion services. This means operating clinics, coordinating volunteers who serve as escorts to patients seeking care, given that crossing protest lines can make it difficult to seek care, mobilizing support for ballot initiatives, lobbying efforts, legal cases, voting, and fundraising. As you can see from these slides I've been showing, both movements engage in similar actions, but on different so-called sides of the issue. But before we move on, I want to complicate the picture. Doing so is important for a few reasons. First, because labels often oversimplify. But second, because I believe that there is actually a lot of unexplored common ground in the in-between space, and that the identifiers of pro-life and pro-choice create principled objections to solutions that could do a lot of good for a lot of people. The labels have become part of the problem, both because they oversimplify and because they enable people on both sides to create a sense of self-righteousness as we build up walls instead of building bridges. Let me put my cards on the table. I had become increasingly uncomfortable with the pro-life movement in the past decade. Here we have the 45th President of the United States, who spoke at the 2020 March for Life. He told followers there that all of us here understand an eternal truth. Every child is a precious and sacred gift from God. Together, we must protect, cherish, and defend the dignity and sanctity of every human life. Those are beautiful words. The scandal of this photo op is that his other actions before and after taking office demonstrate that he's not a good spokesperson for a movement that upholds human dignity. Part of why I became uncomfortable with the identifier pro-life is because members of that movement think that Trump is pro-life. But this means that pro-life has been framed very narrowly, and leaders of the pro-life movement have become increasingly comfortable aligning with the Republican Party. I want to point out areas of common ground with those individuals, while also drawing a line in the sand and admitting that I will not go so far as to claim Trump as a pro-life leader. Indeed, I think he was the opposite. I will argue tonight that we need to move beyond the binary of pro-choice and pro-life in order to be more truthful and more effective as people of faith in the public square. In the past 2 years, even though I've identified I have moved away from identifying as pro-life, I have recovered instead the term reproductive justice feminism, and I'll say more about that later. As a Catholic feminist, I'm looking for ways to eliminate sexual violence, foster sexual relationships of mutual flourishing, expand access to accurate information about sexuality, prevent unwanted pregnancies and teen pregnancies, reduce the number of abortions, and simultaneously fiercely advocate for women's human rights. Tonight, I will not challenge the magisterial teaching that there should always be a presumption against taking human life. Instead, I ask what that means for Catholic participation in political life and pragmatic discernment about how to foster a culture of life most effectively. And it's important to note that the role of a bishop in the public square is different than the role of a Catholic politician or even a Catholic voter. I hope that our conversation can move us forward as a church community to create more spaces for wrestling with moral complexity and ambiguity. Many Americans already recognize this complexity and ambiguity when discussing abortion. Sarah Cliff's reporting from 2015 shows that many Americans are not comfortable picking sides in the abortion debate. In the Perry Undum poll cited by Vox, 32% of respondents identified as pro-choice, 26% as pro-life, but a larger number refused to be categorized, and the remaining 42% identified as both, neither, or they refused to answer the question. I think this is because so many of us see that when a woman finds herself in need of an abortion, the abortion is not the only problem she faces. How can our moral vocabulary and political action better account for this growing awareness? For those who share the goal of reducing the number of abortions in the US, it's important to note that we are making progress. According to the Guttmacher Institute, between 2011 and 2017, the number of abortions fell by 196,000, a 19% decline in those years. The abortion rate fell by 20%, from 16.9 in 2011 to 13.5 in 2017. The abortion ratio also fell during this time period. These declines are not necessarily due to increased abortion restrictions, but rather to a decline in the overall number of pregnancies, which could be attributable to increased access to affordable contraception, a decline in sexual activity, or increased infertility among women and men of reproductive age. Scholars are still trying to figure that out. Still, for those working to decrease the number of abortions, it's important to know how prevalent abortion remains. The Guttmacher Institute reports that 18% of pregnancies, excluding miscarriages, in 2017 ended in abortion. It may be startling for us to realize, but at 2014 rates, 1 in 4 US women will have an abortion by the age of 45. And as Rachel Atkins has stated, there aren't women who have abortions and women who have babies. Those are the same women at different points in their lives. And we need to realize that our sisters, aunts, mothers, grandmothers, friends, and even neighbors beside us in the pews are indeed among this number. 24% of abortion patients in 2014 identified as Catholic. More Catholics have abortions than mainline Protestants or evangelical Protestants. Abortion has become a routine part of women's reproductive healthcare delivery in the US context. I am a Catholic feminist who wants to support real women in precarious situations, and not at the cost of shaming women in the pews or of perpetuating a toxic partisan political climate. We need a movement to reduce abortions that is pro-woman and pro-justice in the very thickest sense. As we enter the second year of COVID lockdown, we need to keep in mind the urgent life questions that confront us. Coronavirus has exposed and worsened social inequalities throughout the globe. Not everyone has a home in which to shelter in place. Rising numbers of domestic violence help us understand that home is not always safe, especially for women and children. Pregnancy can be an especially dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship, as abuse often begins or escalates during pregnancy when an abusive and controlling partner resents how a pregnant woman's attention shifts to her growing belly and planning for her future. Communities of color are disproportionately infected and affected by COVID-19 in the US. In an economic system in which healthcare is seen as a benefit for some employees instead of as a human right, many workers have lost access to healthcare benefits when they lost their jobs. We've also seen that not all workers can work from home. Lower wage workers deemed essential, such as grocery store clerks, hospital staff, meatpacking workers, sanitation crews, and others, face more dangerous conditions than higher wage workers, many of whom can accomplish their work remotely. But for those workers who are also parents, what are they to do when schools are not open? To analyze our COVID-19 experience through a gendered lens is very important. With regard to the focus of our work tonight, it's important to understand why many working women are leaving the workforce right now. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, there were 2.2 million fewer women in the labor force in October 2020 than in October 2019. But women are not necessarily choosing to leave. As economist Catherine Edwards argues, women are being shoved out by disproportionate job loss, shuttered schools, lack of childcare, pay disparities, and lack of public policy to support working women. I teach a lot of young women who are undergraduate students hoping to have some kind of work-life balance in their future, some of whom are here tonight. If I've learned anything in the past year as a working mom, it is that we do not live in a pro-life society that is ready to welcome, celebrate, and support the gifts that these women will contribute to the workforce. Working parents have been asked to do the impossible in the past year, and it is not sustainable. Elementary schools and childcare centers are still not open across the country a year after they closed. Children in San Diego Unified School District returned to in-person learning on April 12th, 2021. The well-being of women with reproductive capacity has not been a priority for our country. Attention to both the joys and the difficulties of parenting must become part of our moral vocabulary if we are to make any progress in moving beyond the binary, as I am recommending that we do. So section 2, Catholic teachings on life issues. Cardinal Joseph Bernardin is credited with articulating the consistent ethic of life, which he developed in his 1983 Gannon lecture at Fordham University, in which he said he was convinced that the pro-life position of the church must be developed in terms of a comprehensive and consistent ethic of life. He saw the same principle operating in Catholic teaching against nuclear war as in Catholic teaching against abortion, namely the principle which prohibits the directly intended taking of innocent human life. It is this principle then, and the corresponding attitude of respect for human life, that must be applied consistently across all moral issues. Bernardin then explains how this would demand a heroic social ethic that would translate to political and economic positions on tax policy, welfare policy, nutrition and feeding programs, and healthcare. More recently, Jesuit author Jim Martin has explicitly advocated for this position when he linked his advocacy for refugees, the LGBTQ community, and the environment to his consistent ethic of life position. The writings of Pope Francis call our attention to this consistent ethic of life in Amoris Laetitia, Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, Querida Amazonia, and Fratelli Tutti. And you can see this wide range of issues here on the slide that Pope Francis has been calling our attention to. All of these are life issues. 38 years after Bernardin's lecture, does the pro-life movement reflect his vision of a heroic social ethic? Does the pro-life movement reflect this wide range of issues that we see here on the slide that Pope Francis has been drawing our attention to? Pro-life politicians and self-appointed pro-life leaders gathered at the rally on January 6th, in which then President Trump told his supporters to take back their country, leading to the insurrection many of us followed live on the news. The victories celebrated by spokespeople of the pro-life movement included weakening of healthcare legislation and attempts at new restrictions on contraception access within employer healthcare plans for working women. I can't name these as victories. How did we get here? The 1973 National Conference of Catholic Bishops explicitly called for civil disobedience to resist laws legalizing abortion. In 1975, they crafted their pastoral plan for pro-life activities, which outlined a grassroots mobilization effort against abortion and initiated a strategy of endorsing a single issue approach to election politics, focusing on abortion policy in their analysis of candidates for office. The plan specifically encouraged Catholics to oppose each and every political candidate who supported the legalization of abortion. 46 years later, the pastoral plan has undergone revision, but the bishops restate the need to give, quote, urgent attention and priority to abortion as a life issue. They name their political aim, and I quote, "The abortion decisions of the US Supreme Court must be reversed. Our own commitment will not waver. Our efforts will not cease. We will speak out on behalf of the sanctity of life wherever and whenever it is threatened," end quote. The thing is, their plan is not inclusive of equivalent political action with regard to education, homelessness, climate change, unemployment, mass incarceration, racism, immigration, and many other life issues. The pastoral plan for pro-life activities is not guided by a consistent ethic of life, but rather by a focus on abortion. Here and elsewhere, the consistent ethic of life is a rhetorical tool that is employed haphazardly. Had the consistent ethic of life been a guiding force in the crafting of the pastoral plan, one would have expected to see equal attention to a broader range of life issues and an urgent appeal to Catholics to get involved beyond issues of advocacy for unborn children. The USCCB says that they offer principled, not partisan solutions. A consistent ethic of life provides a challenge to both Democratic and Republican platforms and legislative agendas. Neither political party maps neatly onto Catholic teachings. I'm going to repeat that. Neither political party maps neatly onto Catholic teachings. But when abortion is prioritized above all other life issues, as regularly happens in the pro-life movement's rhetoric, this tips the scales toward Republican agendas. The alliances forged between the pro-life movement and the Republican Party seem to have the blessing of many Catholic pastors and bishops, especially those who have become more partisan in their own rhetoric. This was true not only during the 2020 presidential campaign, but also after it. On the day of President Biden's inauguration, Most Reverend Jose Gomez, president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, issued a statement outlining the points of contrast between their own teachings and those of the new administration. He reiterated that, quote, abortion remains the preeminent priority, end quote, even as he claimed that bishops are not partisan. Hogwash. The point that I want to restate here is not so much that the bishops name abortion as a moral issue. Abortion is a moral issue. The problem is that they regularly elevate it as a preeminent priority, and this creates unnecessary confusion. Also, their strategies in addressing abortion have been flawed. As a feminist working on these issues, I want to restate that the goal is to reduce the number of abortions. Many feminists have noted that it would demonstrate respect for women if the culture treated women as subjects capable of being persuaded to the good, as moral agents capable of making decisions for themselves. If we are to work together to reduce the number of abortions, we need to stop talking past one another and develop strategies that create safer communities, healthier sexual relationships, and stronger social supports for vulnerable women and children. So that leads me to my third section, a better way forward. Global social movements are born when communities come together to say enough. The status quo is not working. Things must change. Successful social movements energize their base by identifying clearly what the group must resist and then constructing a vision of transformation. So first, what must we resist? A renewed social movement to reduce abortions must resist patriarchy, resist a double standard morality, resist oversimplification, and resist single issue politics. We see evidence of patriarchal attitudes and practices, not only in the Catholic Church, but also in US culture more broadly. The Church must resist patriarchy in all its ugly forms, including clericalism, benevolent sexism, toxic masculinity, and theological discourse that assumes that the normative human is male. Intersectional analysis is essential in our approach to these questions now. In resisting patriarchy today, we must attend in particular to the health inequities that shape the decisions of women of color in the US who continue to experience systemic disadvantages. We must also resist the double standard morality so prevalent in abortion cases. Those women did not get pregnant by themselves, but male responsibility is often overlooked. A gender ideology rooted in different roles for men and women has in fact led to different standards for men and women to the detriment of women. On college campuses today, sexually active men gain social status while sexually active women lose social status. Meanwhile, male responsibility for care of children is often overlooked or downplayed. Dads who help out at home are praised, helped, and offered encouragement for their heroic parenting efforts, while struggling moms are shamed, stigmatized, and punished. Double standards are unfair and should have no part in our moral discourse. We need to resist oversimplification of our terms in the abortion debates. Catholic leaders frequently describe prenatal life before viability as human life, without recognition of the contingent nature of prenatal life. Rebecca Todd Peters has argued persuasively for an understanding of pregnancy as a liminal space. We should train our moral intuitions to recognize how the pregnant body is different from the non-pregnant body and how prenatal life is different from newborn life. Western discourse is not trained as well to recognize the fetus as both part and not part of its mother. Patricia Beatty-Jung warned us over 3 decades ago of the problem of romanticizing pregnancy and motherhood in Christian theological discourse, saying that it reflects a failure of persons on both sides of the abortion debate to take the experiences of women seriously. Attending more systematically to the breadth of women's experiences of pregnancy and motherhood will be essential for our moral evaluation going forward. That's because the circumstances of every pregnancy are different. Our moral tradition is capable of recognizing great variability while at the same time raising up principles to guide moral discernment in complex cases. It does violence to women when we speak in moral absolutes that do not reflect the realities of their messy lives. I suggest that we also need to resist the temptation to obscure the complexity of life issues by focusing on abortion as the heart of our approach to the common good. Life in the womb does not have any greater claim on us than lives threatened by structural violence of war, food insecurity, homelessness, police brutality, gang violence, substance abuse, poverty, child neglect and abuse, and migration. A consistent ethic of life highlights many other related life issues that merit attention in a new movement for reproductive justice. A renewed movement for reproductive justice must resist patriarchy, resist a double standard morality, resist oversimplification, and resist single issue politics. But we cannot only be known for what we resist. In order to affirm women's agency, we need to understand the reality of their stories, and one cannot presume to know fully what you have not experienced. That's because no 2 abortion stories are the same. If we try to listen to women, we will learn that the reasons women give for having an abortion underscore their understandings of the responsibilities of parenthood and family life. The 3 most common reasons, each cited by 3/4 of patients, were concern for or responsibility to other individuals, the inability to afford raising a child, and the belief that having a baby would interfere with work, school, or the ability to care for dependents. Half said that they did not want to be a single parent or were having problems with their husband or partner. Many women have chosen not to tell their abortion stories in ecclesial context because of the way that church teaching on abortion contributes to shaming discourse. For example, using terms like abominable crime, grave offense, or moral evil. These terms, from catechism classes to the pulpit, can foster a discourse that labels women as sinners without taking into account the complexities of the moral discernments that women face and the myriad ways in which their male partners are complicit in the threats to unborn life. So women's experiences of infertility, miscarriage, pregnancy, and abortion must become part of our moral discourse to a much greater degree than they are already in church spaces, and embedded in so many stories about women's reproductive choices are women navigating a complicated world in which they are making choices within situations of constrained agency. When Pope Francis talks about listening, he reminds us of the need for humility before the mystery of the other, reminding us that each person's situation before God and their life in grace are mysteries which no one can fully know from without. I propose that the church needs to do a lot more of this kind of listening. And as more women begin to share their stories of pregnancy and pregnancy loss, we need to wrestle with the complexity and the ambiguity of their stories. If our aim is to reduce the number of abortions, then we need to understand the ways that women are already making judgments about what it is possible for them to do. Pope Francis furthers his claim in his October 2020 encyclical Fratelli Tutti. He says, and I quote, the organization of societies worldwide is still far from reflecting clearly that women possess the same dignity and identical rights as men. We say one thing with words, but our decisions and reality tell another story. Indeed, doubly poor are those women who endure situations of exclusion, mistreatment, and violence, since they are frequently less able to defend their rights. I advocate here for a reproductive justice movement that begins by listening to and supporting women from all cross-sections of society. I did not create this terminology. Feminists in the Reproductive Rights National Network used the language of reproductive justice in the 1970s. In the summer of 1994, 12 Black women created the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice campaign after meeting together in Chicago. So I've adapted their terminology of reproductive justice. Reproductive justice feminist Marilyn Katz, founder of Reproductive Rights National Network, or R2N2, stated that the real impetus for the network was to reframe the debate, to talk about the conditions which would be necessary for women to be able to make a real choice about whether or not to have children. R2N2 did not narrow their political agenda to abortion rights, but perceived their cause much more broadly to include access to affordable childcare, healthcare, a living wage, birth control, and disability pay during pregnancy for working women. For R2N2, any political strategy that did not attend to these structural needs was inadequate. Following Roe, many in the abortion rights movement argued that abortion was a private matter, but reproductive rights feminists were suspicious about the anthropological basis for this private-public distinction, thinking that the same line of reasoning would be used to argue that the state did not have a role to play in providing childcare, prenatal health care, or protection for women in abusive relationships in the so-called private sphere of the home. Marlene Gerber-Fried claimed in a critique of abortion rights feminists that the decision to fight for choice rather than justice is itself a decision to appeal to those who already have choices. Scholar activist Loretta J. Ross explains further, and this is a quote, "In abortion debates of privacy, women's rights, fetuses, and the law, the isolation of abortion from other social justice issues like violence against women fails to incorporate the intersecting issues that actually determine how a pregnant woman makes the decision to have a baby. She may base her decision on available healthcare, housing, violence, age, finances, her partner, education, immigration status, or other considerations. Combinations of social and economic issues matter," end quote. Look, parents have to figure out how to pay the bills. We must think about reproduction with greater recognition of the social and economic constraints that pregnant women face. Scholar activists in these RJ networks, most of whom are women of color, are teaching us about the best way forward today. I want to circle back now to a more explicitly Catholic claim to ask, what would it mean for Catholics to win the abortion debate? Because so many in the pro-life community think that to win the abortion debate is going to happen in a legislative victory. But I agree here with Kathleen Rudy that Catholics will not win the abortion debate in the Supreme Court, Senate, House of Representatives, or even state legislatures. We need to recalibrate what it would mean to win. Following Kathleen Rudy, as stated on the slide, I believe that a tradition only wins in the abortion debate when a woman with an unwanted pregnancy sees the hope and possibilities offered to her by that tradition and changes her interpretation of her pregnancy as a result. Every year around the Feast of the Epiphany, a meme circulates on Facebook that captures my vision of this new action plan for reproductive justice. In contrast to the story of the Magi that we hear in Matthew's infancy narrative, this contemporary feminist midrash explains, 3 wise women would have asked directions, arrived on time, helped deliver the baby, brought practical gifts, cleaned the stable, made a casserole, and there would be peace on earth. The wisdom embedded here is practical, everyday feminist wisdom. That's what women facing unplanned pregnancies need to hear from our church and from a new social movement today. Julie Hanlon-Rubio has stated that reducing the abortion rate in the US depends on identifying strategies that can be pursued by both liberals and conservatives working together at the grassroots level. These wise women lead the way. To that end, this final section of my talk explains what a Catholic action plan for reproductive justice would prioritize. Listening to women, changing our political strategy, providing robust structural supports for women and children, and attending to a wider range of life issues. So it begins by centering women in our abortion discourse. We must listen to women's experiences. Out of what is heard, then we take action. One important step forward would be to appoint a women-led subcommittee at the USCCB to create new series of liturgies for Catholic women healing from miscarriage, sexual violence, and abortion. We should also develop an entirely new communication strategy on reproductive justice issues. From the USCCB to diocesan family life offices and parish bulletins, we need messaging that empowers people in difficult discernments. Shaming discourse must be eliminated from our formal communications, and the consistent ethic of life must be evident in all communications. Every diocese should revise its employment contracts so that pregnant employees feel supported and encouraged to choose life for their unborn children. We also need to change our political strategy. We should stop efforts to criminalize abortion. The focus of the pro-life movement should not be overturning Roe v. Wade, crafting more restrictive legislation at the state level, or seeking to defund Planned Parenthood. While the research is speculative, a number of studies have argued that overturning Roe is not the most effective strategy in reducing the abortion rate. If we follow this action plan, we limit the ways that politicians and their proxies have used abortion as an issue to divide Americans, fostering a toxic political climate. This would be a significant shift for the Catholic Church to adopt, but I suggest that it would bear fruit and that it would create possibilities for new alliances across party lines. I do advocate for partnerships with Planned Parenthood. This is important in areas where there's legitimate common ground. Those include judgment-free response to survivors of sexual assaults, comprehensive sexual education, STD testing, stigma reduction and suicide prevention for LGBTQ population, cancer screenings, and wellness counseling. Recognizing different missions and organizational values, there will not be strategic alliance in all areas, but a new social movement for reproductive justice will stop demonizing Planned Parenthood, which is one of the largest providers of healthcare for women in the United States. A Catholic action plan for reproductive justice would also prioritize structural supports for women and children. We should provide free or at least sliding scale infant daycare at every Catholic parish and place of work, including Catholic hospitals and universities. Building a culture of life extends far beyond the maternal delivery room. Women discerning whether to continue a pregnancy know well the high cost of caring for infants and the commitment of parenting. Full-time infant daycare in my community costs $1,200 a month, and that's when daycares are open. And that's unaffordable for many middle-class families, and it's impossible for families living below the poverty line. Catholic parishes would be the ideal spaces for robust sliding scale infant daycare facilities nationwide, serving the needs of their local communities and inclusive of children of all creeds, races, and social classes. And of course, we must address poverty as a constraint to agency. Bumper stickers and marches don't go far enough in giving poor women greater agency. Women with unplanned pregnancies know well that parenting children means providing for their physical, educational, and emotional needs. A renewed movement must advocate for strengthened government support for poor families. This includes revised tax policies, support for equal pay for equal work laws, non-discrimination laws, robust support of fair housing, and a solid welfare safety net, including food programs and universal health care. There is also a role for middle axioms of support here, from parish-based food pantries to Facebook groups for sharing used clothing and other kinds of supplies, as well as direct support from family and friends. And finally, our plan needs to nurture and protect all life. We need to join the Green Revolution. Laudato Si expands our vision of what a consistent ethic of life means. Rejecting anthropocentrism, Catholics are called to address the life questions that confront us in a world of overconsumption, globalization, militarism, and destruction of the natural world. Responsible fertility must be discerned in light of this ecological crisis on our planet, which cannot sustain unlimited procreativity. If the Church is to attend to all issues that threaten life, we need to join Pope Francis in advocating for an end to the death penalty and for comprehensive immigration reform rooted in care for the migrant and refugee. And we must not settle for the status quo of maternal and infant mortality rates that disproportionately impact communities of color. In Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis acknowledges, it is also true that we have done little to adequately accompany women in very difficult situations where abortion appears as a quick solution to their profound anguish, especially when the life developing within them is the result of rape or a situation of extreme poverty. Who can remain unmoved before such painful situations? We can and must do better. Another movement is possible. I started off tonight talking about the terms pro-life and pro-choice. Maybe some of you still feel strongly about those labels and you want to keep them. Fine. Call yourself pro-life, pro-choice, neither or both. But labels don't go far enough. We need action. And if you're tired of labels, seeing how they too often create divisions instead of opportunities to work together, know that there are a lot of people who are right there with you. You can still be a good Catholic while opting out of a stale political pro-life movement that focuses on legislative agendas that restrict women's choices. Another movement is possible, a movement that would reduce abortions while empowering women to make better choices. But to get there, we will have to work together across partisan lines, across lines of race, class, and creed. And we'll have to ensure that women actually have choices. During this Lent, we are all invited to recommit to an action plan for social justice. We need a renewed social movement for reproductive justice, a movement that will begin by listening to women's complex stories, accompanying them on their journeys, empowering them to make decisions that align with their deepest values, and reorganizing our social structures to resemble the care of those most in need. This new social movement will transform our parish infrastructure to serve the needs of the smallest among us. This new movement will build bridges of understanding between social service agencies and advocacy groups that are interested, as we are, in rejecting patriarchal power dynamics and fostering women's agency and moral discernment. I hope that you will join me as we work together in a social movement for reproductive justice, no matter what labels you use to describe yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, for a very challenging presentation. Now I would ask anybody that has a question, would you please submit your questions through the chat function? One thing that occurs to me as you were presenting, and you presented a list of kind of policy objectives. It seems like with Laudato Si, where he calls for an integral conversion, it seems to me that to address these issues, we're going to need a cultural conversion of a major sort to address them. Do you want to comment on that?
What a nice way of thinking about it, a cultural conversion. Yeah, I think, actually, I don't think that's something new. In a sense, that provides continuity with what Pope John Paul II was calling for in Evangelium Vitae. And even though, you know, for so many within the pro-life movement, Evangelium Vitae is one of those documents that they will often go to in order to talk about, the unborn child's right to life. Evangelium Vitae also talks about the importance of building a culture of life and of recognizing the reality of structural dimensions that constrain women's culpability and constrain women's choices. And so I think if we talk about what we need to do in order to transform our culture, that's not new in Pope Francis. It's actually building some connections to some of these texts from the past. But you're right. I think that is what's required, and that part of what I'm trying to argue here is that the patriarchal mindset that we so often see within the church is a stumbling block to that, to that conversion. And, we're kind of swimming in patriarchy all the time within Catholicism, and that often sets up some barriers and blind spots, especially when we're talking about women's bodies. Even to the point of like, who's at the table talking about women's bodies? And so when we talk about the importance of structural change and conversion, those are important themes, but also I would like to ask us, like, in terms of process, how are we going to get there? How are women's voices going to be heard?
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Ken Serban, who says that we need to look at countries like Germany, where there are publicly funded breastfeeding coaches who automatically check on new mothers. We need a system like that here. Please comment.
Well, that's a great comment, Ken. Thank you. I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, there are a lot of countries that have really robust supports for new moms, really robust supports. I mean, not only do they have job protection, some sort of basic job protection, which some workers in the US have, but not all workers, not all, female workers have that job protection. But there are countries that have, beyond job protection, extended maternity leave, guaranteed health care. And on top of that, a system of welfare support of nurses who will check in. And that can include even lactation specialists, those who specialize in postpartum depression, for example, and other things that are particular to women's experience and embodied experience of recovering from childbirth. So I think that we have a lot to learn from Germany and from other countries that are doing this well. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Ken.
Thank you. Steve Conroy writes, first, I really applaud your courage to take on this very difficult topic in a thoughtful, intelligent way. I have a quick question and a slight pushback, but please understand I agree with your basic thesis. First, on slide 11, could a fourth explanation for reduction of abortions also be technology in the form of the morning after pill? I assume that was not counted as abortion. Secondly, you assert that male responsibility is often overlooked. I would suggest this cuts both ways, and as a male have always been concerned that men have zero power in the abortion decision. If women choose an abortion, men cannot prevent this, no matter how opposed to the decision they may be.
Yeah, thank you for both of those questions. Let me start with the first one. So the scholars that I'm looking to are part of the Guttmacher Institute, and they do capture medicated abortion in the first 12 weeks in their abortion statistics. So they, to the extent that they can, and obviously there are some that they can't capture in that, especially in some of the ways that some women are now procuring them through the mail and outside of some of the contexts that used to be more standard and easier to track. But the Guttmacher Institute does say that they're capturing medicated abortion that's self-administered in those statistics. But what they're trying to push back on is the claim that abortions are going down because of the restrictions are going up. That's something that remains contested in the literature, if you're familiar with it, because pro-life advocates would see this as one of, as a cause for victory. But the way that the Guttmacher Institute is interpreting the data, they actually see access to contraception as the major reason why abortions are going down. And then they name some others, and that can include increased infertility, as well as perhaps a decreased sexual activity or later age of the onset of sexual activity. And so part of what I tried to capture at the beginning in terms of my goals as a feminist trying to create some common ground is to say that I think that if we're talking about wanting to create healthy sexual relationships, then access to accurate information, comprehensive sex education, thinking through red flags of violence prevention within unhealthy relationships, all of that I think should be part of this, common ground that we're building together. And in my view, contraception access would be, for some relationships, a part of that, although that departs from authoritative Catholic teaching, which is opposed to direct contraception. So I guess, Steve, we can keep talking about that at another time. With regard to male responsibility, you make an excellent point. And part of what we are responding to now is the reality of how Roe v. Wade framed abortion rights as a privacy issue. And that did have some effects. And, I don't think all feminists, especially even Catholic feminists, would ideally like to continue to use that language, especially in the ways that, as you name, it diminishes the role of whether we're talking about the father or the impregnating partner. And yet, nevertheless, since one of my goals is to empower women to make choices that are coherent with their values, and I would want to tease that out in another context and unpack that a little bit more. But since that's really central to what I'm doing, I want to resist a claim that that's always in conflict with her partner. And again, I think you're making an excellent point that men have been sidelined, and I'm calling for men to take more responsibility, but legally they can't always do so. But I guess I want to say, in a healthy sexual relationship, then from the beginning, there should be mutuality and equality and strong communication, and then we might prevent some of those concerns that you're talking about.
Thank you. We have a question from Samuel Hardwick, who is a high school teacher. And he says, I'm curious what we can do to encourage young boys specifically to understand their part and decision in sexual activity and pregnancies.
Yeah, this is a great follow-up on Steve's question. So thank you for that. I mean, I would like to talk to young men about respecting their partners and the importance of strong communication and respectful relationships. There's been a lot of focus on consent in the past few years. And that's really important, especially, with the Me Too movement and the growing recognition of the reality of violence. And yet I think we need to talk about sexuality and sexual relationships beyond just verbal consent. And as long as you have two consenting partners, then it must be okay. We need to have a much thicker language for talking about that. I actually think that our moral tradition does contribute to helping us with that language, and that we talk about intimacy within certain kinds of relationships that provide a sense of stability and mutuality. We talk about pleasure as a goal, but it's not a selfish kind of pleasure. So if we're looking at sexuality from this perspective of the growth of the person and moving beyond just a do no harm framework, but a flourishing framework, then I think that's going to really help. And of course, that translates not just to whether we're talking to young men or young women, but that would be helpful in sort of all contexts.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence Meyer writes that the big COVID relief bill appears to be the first effort to lessen income inequality and help women in decades. Comment. I
agree. Thank you, Larry. Yes, I mean, I haven't read the whole thing because it's like 400 pages plus, right? So in the reporting that I've seen, and I know that it's gone back and forth, and maybe even some of the things that I really wanted to be in got struck. But on the whole, I think that it's moving in a helpful direction, providing some supports that are very sorely needed, not just in the educational and family sector, but in other sectors as well. Yeah. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you. So we have a question from Lucila Servicha. I'm botching her name, but she says, is there a clear line between the difference between abortion and infanticide?
Well, that is a really important question. So, I mean, the clear line would be birth. And yet, as we begin to understand, the development of fetal life, over those months in the womb, and especially the bonding that occurs between the woman and the baby in many contexts, although not in every pregnancy. I do think that speaks to the reluctance that so many have to recognize the licitness of abortion, even in some contexts. So what I hear in the question is, not just when do we call it infanticide, which would be after birth, but, how do we talk about this spectrum and recognize that life is a process and that the church is calling us to respect for life from conception to natural death. But that there, what I would like to do in a longer context would be to, talk about some of the differences that happen over the course of the development of the fetus, and some of the ways that moralists have talked about that development over time. So, whether we talk about quickening in the way that some used to, or, the difference between contingent life and, reaching the level of viability, that there are ways in which moral theologians have really wrestled with what it means to respect the unborn person at different stages of fetal development. And, you can see I'm using lots of different terms there that for some people, have a lot of special meaning and might be contested. And if I had longer time, I would unpack that a little bit. But I continue to use all of those terms because they continue to be meaningful for a lot of people. So whether we talk about personhood or unborn life or fetal life or contingent life, I think that it's important both to be precise, but also to use the language that pregnant women use. And the reality is that pregnant women use lots of different terms and find lots of different terms to be meaningful for them. I hope that helps somewhat.
Thank you. We have a question from Kathy Cox who says, do we also need to consider how we define and understand work to realize your goals of a renewed pro-life movement? Parenting is often not seen as work, yet it is hard, takes time, requires planning, communications, etc. All the things we recognize in our paid labor.
Boy, you're speaking my language, Kathy. Thank you for that. Yes, and I think you're so right to name that it is work, and yet it's often unacknowledged, often unpaid. I mean, the reality of that is that's just the reality of it, right? To keep the household running. But that labor, still has to be done. And so I think you're right to name that as a problem where we're wrestling with the nature of work itself, and how does our work contribute to the flourishing of our family, local community, more broadly to our national community and to the world, but thinking through sort of the category of work and whose work counts, and shouldn't work count even though it's not work that someone gets a paycheck for. This is why I'm troubled by the so-called mommy wars, of working women often being pitted against stay-at-home moms. And I find that to be terribly disappointing and disruptive for building, coalitions of feminist women but also because some of that rhetoric also yields the same kind of shame-based discourse that we see, in even other kinds of church settings. So leads to questions about, am I ever doing good enough? Can women have it all? I think some of those questions are just deeply misguided. And if it's framed in that way, without social supports, women are never going to be able to do it all. We have to think beyond just those kinds of false choices of pitting women against each other, or creating a new kind of like identity struggle. But I appreciate you raising that question. That's one I need to think more about.
Thank you. The esteemed Kevin Murray writes, how do we find the safe place to dialogue about reproductive justice in these new ways? Both sides are so polarized. Are you leading any discussion groups?
Let's do it. I have to admit that I was reluctant to write about this before I had tenure. I just want to name that. It's hard even as someone who has a lot of training in this area to wade into these waters in a university setting that is as wonderful as USD is. There are still a lot of very, angry and rigid people on both sides. And I'm trying to carve out some space in the middle, which means I'm inevitably pissing off people on both sides. So I don't want to create enemies, but I want to create some space for that difficult dialogue. And I recognize that that can sometimes feel hard and dangerous. I would welcome conversation with anyone here tonight on Zoom, or when we all have our vaccines, God forbid soon, or God willing soon. Sorry for that misspoke. That we can do that in the parish setting would be ideal, if there are priests open to that. And certainly in a classroom space, we have more freedom and flexibility to do that in the context of academic freedom and course design. And I'm very grateful that my students are open to these kinds of conversations within the classroom. But I have talked to a lot of people who are hungry for these kinds of questions, conversations, and also see some of the debates, in the media, even as they frame Catholic debates as being polarizing. And I think it's important for us to find spaces where we can move beyond that as much as possible. I would also suggest that part of what we do is not just gather to discuss, as important as that is. It's important in reproductive justice settings. It's important in anti-racism work to gather and discuss and educate ourselves on this topic, to think through these dilemmas, learn the moral vocabulary. All of that is really important. But then it's also important to practice it and to ask ourselves, what is our parish community doing to nurture and support new life? What is our parish community doing, or what is our university community doing to create an infant daycare center? What are the barriers right now that pregnant women experience, and how can we, demolish those barriers so that pregnant women no longer feel constrained by those kinds, of choices? And so thinking through not just how we need to come together to talk, but also what kind of actions we can put into place.
Well, we have time for just one more question. We have a follow-up from Pete from Milpitas, who asks, you say the church needs to listen to women, but what sorts of structures are available that listening can take place?
Well, I think that there are structures in place to foster that kind of listening, but sometimes it also means leaning into uncomfortable discussions or initiating a conversation that one might not initially feel comfortable doing. I find sometimes that feminism is used as like another bad F word in some Catholic settings. So maybe that's a baby step, a place to start. Like, read a little, and feminist theology as one suggestion of a reading group at a local, a local level, or have that be a Lenten practice that one adopts in order to kind of lean into these questions. Another that I find particularly challenging is reading the stories of women who have made difficult choices. And sometimes that's the difficult choice to carry a child to term, even when there were some known complications and a risk to one's health. There are memoirs that are quite moving. Sometimes that's a complicated decision to terminate a pregnancy. And again, it's often in the context of really limiting kinds of constraints. And so really wrestling with the story of another. And often that's through nonfiction for me, but that can also be through fiction. And I think that the more that we're encountering other people's stories, especially if those stories are different from our own, then those stories can help us to build a deep sense of empathy. And it can lead us to what Pope Francis is talking about when he challenges us to accompany one another in these difficult moral discernments. So it's a lot harder to impose my view of the world on someone else when I start to walk in their shoes and understand how different life looks from their perspective. And, I think that can be a really important way to recalibrate the way that we do moral theology on all levels. So storytelling is another way.
Thank you very much. We have one tribute before we go that I would like to read to you. This is from Jackie Gamble, who says, I just wanted to send a thank you to Emily for the most thoughtful and broad discussion of this topic I've ever heard in a Catholic context. One that included the need to look at differences in outcomes depending on race, economic resources, etc. Peace and all good to you, Emily. And so we'll let that be the last word this evening. Thank you very much, Emily, for a very challenging and informative, inspiring talk. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to work on. And so thank you very much, and continue this discussion. Just a quick advertisement before we leave. The center is hosting a series on the papal encyclical Laudato Si, another life issue on care for our common home. And our next session is Thursday at 5:30. So anybody who is interested in attending, please contact us as we reflect on these important issues. Again, thank you very much, Emily. We'd love to see you hopefully in person sometime.
Yes. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks for coming, everyone.